they're not organized the way that a Delta is, where they have to be able to fly you everywhere, all at once, right? You could see portions of the airline get sold off under this architecture, or see the easyJet conglomerate get broken into a series of smaller airlines.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Airways Podcast, continuing with season 10 and also on our 10-year anniversary this summer. Vinay, how have you been? It's been a minute.
It has been a minute. We definitely have what I would describe as an irregular recording schedule. I think we've settled into at least once a month so far this year. I would say the most impressive thing on this screen right now is your shirt. Is that what's going on there? Walk me through what this whole situation is.
Yeah, if you go to publictee.com, they have a bunch of awesome aviation-related shirts. So, like, I have a DFW one, I have a Delhi one that I'm wearing right now, I have an O'Hare one. So these are all like cities that I've either lived in or my family's from. The other one that I would have would be Minneapolis, maybe, or Santiago de Chile if I ordered those T-shirts. Are you mocking me or are you jealous of me? I can't tell.
A little bit of both. Who knew that AI slop could turn into such a fire T-shirt?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean,
Designed and fulfilled
publictee.com
by Claude. Okay, yeah. All right, well.
Well, for many years, I've been wearing these airline T-shirts, and I was actually in Delhi wearing around a Pakistan International Airlines T-shirt, which shout out to PIA. They've been privatized, so things can change, right?
Well, if you look at what happened with Air India post their privatization, things may have simultaneously changed and not changed all that much, all things considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And with regards to you, how has your travel scheduling been? What has been new this summer? Are you able to enjoy some time off?
Time off is an illusion. No, I definitely have been on the road a little bit less in the last couple of months. I've popped over to England a couple of times, so flying into and out of Heathrow. Just had an experience this past weekend of having my bags actually get lost by British Airways. Had a bunch of checked bags, one of which was left overnight in JFK and didn't arrive until almost 36 hours later.
Oof.
And in fact, it was supposed to arrive maybe like 12 hours later. Basically, we, landed and then on the first overnight flight, but got delayed because deliveries in central London were slowed down because of road closures for the annual Pride Parade. So that was my experience of travel logistics and travel pain this past weekend. How about you? Any recent flights of interest?
Yeah, so I added a couple new dots to my dots, lines, destinations chart, if you will. I traveled to Hilton Head Island in late May. That's where my brother was married. And so, believe it or not, both United and American fly into Hilton Head. It was interesting because it's very rainy certain parts of the year. And so the rain combined with the heat also created a lot of aircraft diversions to nearby Savannah or Charleston. So some of the wedding guests had a bit of surprise when that took place, including, fellow av geeks. Like, shout out to my friend Austin, who was delayed on that. And then I also traveled to Bermuda. We did a family trip for my mom's 70th birthday. And I was very intrigued by the very quiet nature of Bermuda Airport. I expected it to be more like Bahamas or Grand Cayman or Montego Bay in terms of busyness, but really it's kind of a one flight wonder airport with a transatlantic to Heathrow and then just like a one daily to the majors like Newark, JFK, Toronto, Philadelphia, Miami, Atlanta, and Charlotte. American is by far like the largest with frequencies to like Charlotte, Miami, JFK, and Philly. And then there's also JetBlue. But yeah, Bermuda's kind of a sleepy airport.
Well, you've also got this wild operation that's being run by Bermudair, right? Where starting later this fall, they're going to have service, again, with a fleet of 4 aircraft, which is the funny part, to Belize and Guatemala and Providenciales and Turks and Caicos and Fort Lauderdale and Orlando Sanford and Raleigh Durham and St. Petersburg Clearwater. So Bermudair is, I suppose you could squint at it and say they're trying to build sort of like a Copa Airlines
Cabo
of the Caribbean,
or like
or like an Air Cabo Verde, which obviously has gained in prominence after their inspirational run in the World Cup recently. Yeah, no, that's. Did you see any Bermudair planes when you were on the ground, either going in or flying out?
I did, yeah. And the airport's really neat. It's also got pre-clearance, so that's kind of a nice gem that it has. and it has a really great lounge for Priority Pass that wasn't filled. And I was listening to a podcast episode on Dots, Lines, and Destinations where they were going into a deep dive on the Bermuda Air route maps. And so I was intrigued at the idea of booking on Bermuda Air. However, my loyalty to United and Star Alliance got the best of me. So I flew through Newark on the way there and back. Newark, I got to experience the new Terminal A, flying from Chicago through Newark to Bermuda. Is a really nice terminal, made great strides for the experience. On the way back, I flew through Terminal C. However, the food and beverage options at Newark Airport are ghastly in terms of expense. And my flight from Newark to Chicago had been delayed because storms, plus like O'Hare is, as we've all seen in the news, dealing with a lot of delays because of the battle between American and United. So I had what was supposed to be like a 2-hour layover in Newark turned into 4 hours. And when I tried to get food, you order by mobile, and that's essentially the only option you have at Terminal C. Every restaurant has a menu that's an iteration of the other restaurants. And one person, even just like getting an app and a drink, you're going to spend minimum $50. If you want a more replete meal, it's going to be upwards of that. So that was very frustrating. And United wasn't taking one-time passes to the club. So I'm going to continue to avoid Newark, at least as a connecting place.
Yeah, I can't imagine that Newark is a fun place to connect. If you're flying to or from Newark in the unbounded hellscape that is the New York City airport scene, I find that it is no better or no worse than JFK. LaGuardia is obviously more convenient, but the trade-off with LaGuardia is you can only fly nonstop to so many destinations. So I tend to kind of view JFK and Newark as interchangeable. For a lot of domestic flying, Newark has better frequency and better options. For international flying, JFK has better airlines, and that's sort of what tends to mediate my airport choice.
Yeah.
I don't have
Actually,
quite as many interesting airports that I've added recently. It's been a lot of JFK, a lot of Heathrow, like I mentioned. Flew to Minneapolis for the first time in a couple of years. Actually, a cool facility. And then I just added Montgomery, Alabama, also the birthplace of civil rights or the civil rights movement rather here in the United States, to my list of airports. So I added one destination to my Dots, Lines, and Destinations chart in the past month.
nice. Yeah, I have a couple of upcoming travel bits. So I'm going to Amsterdam for World Pride, flying business in Finnair, which I use miles for. And so I'll go Chicago, Helsinki, Amsterdam. I'm very excited because both the Chicago, Helsinki, and Helsinki to Amsterdam flights are operated by the A350, and I'll get to try out or Finnair's new business class, the one that has like the lie flat seat that's not like a lie. It just comes that way. I think it was introduced 4 years ago, and I had just booked a flight on Finnair's legacy product when it was announced. I was like, oh, this whole thing is going to happen and I'm going to miss it. And now I get to actually experience it. On the way back, I'm flying United direct from Amsterdam to Chicago in Economy Plus. And then in October, I'm going to go to Japan. And I'll fly All Nippon Premium Economy from Chicago to Narita, which is a route we'll talk about later this episode. And then on the return, I'm flying out of Osaka, and I booked in EVA business going from Osaka to Taipei and then Taipei to Chicago. So doing a little bit of a
Whoa,
circuitous routing.
that's a backtrack and a half. That's
It
probably
is
an
a
extra
backtrack and a half.
40% destination, or like a distance and travel time wise. So that's true love of the game, if nothing else.
Yeah. We're trying to retain our Star Alliance Gold because we've had it now for 2 years, and it's been a good thing to have. It's been a benefit that I don't want to lose. The extra legroom in Economy Plus, the ability to do same day changes, the discounts that I get on mileage ticket redemptions. I feel really good about United loyalty. And I have now for about, 4 or 5 years since I started traveling again.
It's
for
fascinating
work
because
over
I feel like
leisure.
the people that were already United loyal, myself included, have kind of just seen it sort of slowly degrade. But if you were coming from not having loyalty into having loyalty, there's still some upside in it.
Definitely. Well, we should go ahead and dive into our first topic today. So to start it off, let's go into the SAS aircraft order.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about a couple of topics from Europe, a couple of topics from the United States. First and foremost, we had a pretty massive order for long haul wide body aircraft announced by SAS, now officially part of the Air France KLM group earlier in the month. SAS essentially placed an order for 18 new Airbus A330 900s, A330 Neos, as well as 12 used A330 300s for the interim period until those A330 Neos start getting delivered. And, according to the reporting and SAS commentary, the idea is to use the A330 Neo to strengthen Copenhagen as their sort of like principal or primary long haul hub and, grow connectivity for Copenhagen as a hub within the broader Air France KLM network and ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at SAS's current wide body fleet, they have six sort of older A330 300s and sorry, eight older A330 300s and six A350 900s that they use for long haul service. So even just the A330 Neos represent, close to 50 growth, right? It's 50% larger than their entire existing wide body fleet by themselves. There's 30 wide bodies here in all. Now, I would imagine that some of the A330 300s will be used to replace older frames. Within that, there might be some replacement or some cycling of leases. But on net, this is a pretty massive long haul expansion for SAS.
Yeah. It's probably been one of their biggest in their history, I want to say, because the valuation is at 10 billion, if I'm not mistaken, and up to 40 Airbus wide bodies. And the other element of picking up used A330 300s. That's definitely something that I wasn't expecting on this. I thought that SAS was kind of all in on the A350 and the Airbus A321 series. However, there's been discussions, right? As the spotlight is kind of shifted off of Boeing, it's now shifted onto Airbus. And that discussion has included people debating whether or not the A321 XLR or LR are going to deliver on the promises that they have. In SAS, we know that their network that they have started to include, SAS has started to use the A321 to fly routes to the east coast of the US. They've also been centralizing their hub operations in Copenhagen and cutting back at Oslo and Stockholm. You're starting to really see the Air France KLM and even Delta, just kind of by corollary, influence that is driving a lot of the commercial decisions for SAS.
I think you pointed out a couple of really, really interesting threads there, right? So first, I will say that, SAS his decision here definitely represents a shift in strategy. There was a period in the kind of earlier days of the A321LR and XLR and kind of the sort of promise of narrow body transatlantic flying where it looked like SAS was going to use the 321XLR or the 321LR in their case, to actually meaningfully grow their sort of transatlantic point to point flying, right? At one point, I believe they had service from Gothenburg across the Atlantic. They were using it to serve routes from Oslo to JFK, from Copenhagen to Toronto, so on and so forth. This represents a explicit pivot away from that strategy, away from having multiple long haul hubs across Stockholm and Oslo and Copenhagen to really centralizing on turning Copenhagen into, I don't know, for lack of a better word, more of a mega hub, right? If you look at their long haul operations today, they're down to, at least for the summer, right? If you look at July 2026, they have 6 weekly flights from Stockholm to Newark. They have from Oslo, basically 6 flights a week to Newark and then 7 flights to JFK. And that's it. Everything else touches Copenhagen, right? From Copenhagen, you have service to Atlanta, Tokyo Haneda, Washington Dulles, Seoul, Seattle, San Francisco, Mumbai, Boston, Newark, JFK, Los
And
Angeles,
Mumbai
Chicago,
has had some
and Toronto.
startup challenges, hasn't it?
Mumbai has absolutely had some startup challenges, but I think ultimately, right, there's a really good market opportunity for SAS right now, both just in terms of the growth of the market itself and the, let's call it, continued volatility of some of the traditional traffic flows via the Middle East that historically served a lot of that sort of Nordic to India connecting traffic.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that there was something on the inaugural flight where the flight took off from Copenhagen en route to Mumbai, and they turned around over Azerbaijan because some paperwork issue had happened. And so it ended up being a flight to nowhere. And I don't think that SAS has resumed that flight, but they're still selling inventory for it. It's kind of strange.
Yeah, well, it's in the schedules, right? At least as like an intended sort of long haul operation or long haul flight. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that the broader point still remains, even if you sort of hold Mumbai as a possible addition aside, Copenhagen has become the centralized sort of almost like governing hub of SAS as an airline. But I think like I said, there's two very, very interesting threats. First, you kind of have the sort of like the broken promises and the false dreams of the A321LR. It was supposed to revolutionize their transatlantic business. Now, I would say pretty crucially, some of that was happening in the context of SAS as a standalone carrier. If you look back at the history of SAS, there's always this sort of, for lack of a better word, tension between the three governments, the three countries, and ultimately the three hub airports that comprise the consortium of SAS. There's like a very famous apocryphal joke about SAS that it's like, you know, run by Norwegians day to day with day. I forget the way it's phrased, but like run by Norwegians for like a day, like via day-to-day operations in Denmark for the benefits of the Swedes, or some variation therein, right? Like there's some permutation of a joke in there, and I didn't necessarily articulate that super well, right? But that actually sort of underscores a very, very real tension, right? You have three distinct governments. You have three capital cities that each have their strengths and weaknesses, right? Like Oslo has a lot of wealth and a lot of oil industry traffic. Copenhagen, from a geographic perspective, is by far the best positioned, right? Copenhagen actually can materially serve as a connecting hub for the European continent, for the European sort of like Central Europe, for Western Europe, for Eastern Europe, in a way that Stockholm and Oslo, because they're, a few hundred miles north, meaningfully cannot, right? Copenhagen is the best hub from a geographic perspective, right? Stockholm, the Swedes are also sort of quite wealthy, have a great propensity to travel. All three of these airports have independently their own sources of long haul demand and enough, long haul origin and destination traffic to feed multiple long haul flights per day. And if you look historically, SAS had operations from all of these airports. They had operations to the United States, to Asia, to Northern Africa, and the Middle East from all of these airports. Today, that has centralized entirely on Copenhagen, right? Now, I think some of that is actually downstream of the 321 XLR. If the 321 XLR could actually operate meaningfully into the North American continent, I think there might be some more viability to serve some of these thinner point-to-point routes on a smaller airplane. But in a world where the 321LR, certainly, and the 321XLR can really only get you to the northeastern quadrant of the United States, in Toronto and Montreal, you're looking at a fundamentally different calculus, right? Because at the end of the day, the wide bodies need to flow where the connectivity and where the sort of like the hub is. And these days, that's increasingly Copenhagen. I think the other thing that's worth calling out, right, is having three distinct, roughly equally sized. Copenhagen was always the largest operation, but all three hubs were kind of meaningfully sized. Made a lot of sense for an independent SAS. But when SAS is a part of Air France KLM, all of a sudden, why do you need three distinct hubs? When you look at sort of Paris, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen as a triangle, that's actually a very, very useful sort of entity to have in place. 70% as strong Copenhagen with large, but ultimately not that sort of meaningful operations within, in Stockholm and in Oslo makes entirely sort of less sense, right? And so I think that's the other piece of this, right? Having one Scandinavian hub to pair with Amsterdam and to pair with Paris makes a lot more sense than having three mini hubs. And that's the other kind of strategic element that I think has kicked in.
And with regards to India specifically, I had started a thread on airliners.net that was really oriented around, is SAS going to return to Delhi? Because SAS has dipped its toe into Mumbai, and it looks like it's going to be flying to Mumbai on a daily basis using one of the A330s that they have. But the last time that they served Delhi was actually in 2009, I believe. According to Cirium data, it looks like it was March 2nd, 2009, where they used an A330-300. And they also served it up until a quarterly period in 2008 where they were using the Airbus A340. So basically, SAS has not had a very strong history in India, but I definitely think that that's going to be an important marker for them to consider. However, how will this kind of go along with the strategy that includes Air France, KLM, and Virgin Atlantic?
Yeah, well, I think there's a whole sort of another layer to this. First, I did want to note that I used Cerium quickly while you were kind of sharing that sort of point about India there to quickly run some data and do a side by side comparison, looking back at sort of 2019, the last year pre-pandemic, and 20 versus July of 2026. How has this airline changed over the last 7 years? You go back to July of 2019, Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Oslo are all very similarly sized operations. Copenhagen, each of them has about 130 peak day departures, about 120,000 seats. Copenhagen had more long haul operations, so it was bigger in terms of available seat miles, but they're very, very similarly sized, right? In fact, in terms of total numbers of seats offered on a weekly basis, they were within 600 between Copenhagen and Oslo. Copenhagen is about 126,000 weekly seats. Oslo is about 126,600 versus 126,000. You fast forward to July of 2026, Copenhagen is now close to twice the size of both Oslo and Stockholm, about 170 peak day departures versus 100 at Oslo and a tick over 95 at Stockholm. 60% more weekly seats at Copenhagen relative to Oslo, right? And available seat miles are more than double. Right. So you see both the kind of centralization around Copenhagen as the kind of core hub within the SAS network and the increasing focus of long haul services in particular at Copenhagen. Now, I think your point about the way this fits into the broader transatlantic alliance is also really worth calling out, because I actually think that part of what's happening here within the Air France KLM group as the sort of European half, along with Virgin Atlantic, of the transatlantic SkyTeam joint venture is redundancy and a backup option, given some of the increasing volatility and you might even say outright commercial hostility being faced at Amsterdam Schiphol. Right? Paris Charles de Gaulle continues to be a great hub. London Heathrow is always going to be a constrained environment because Virgin Atlantic doesn't have any short haul European operations. Historically, Paris was the most important sort of transatlantic hub on the European side. Amsterdam was number 2, and KLM was a powerhouse. Coming out of the pandemic, for a variety of different reasons, that has fallen off and has become something that I think that the group can't rely on in the same way. Right? Whether that's downstream of the fact that the airport has had staffing and operational challenges over the last several years, whether that's downstream of the fact that the Dutch government and or judiciary and or local environmental hacks have, what's the right word here, worked together to constrain and attack and tax aviation operations at Schiphol, right? You look historically, Schiphol, in particular for connectivity, right? Part of the reason that Paris has so many operations is because Paris is actually a really big origin and destination. Like it's a really big destination airport for lots of traveling Americans. It's a really big city that has lots of people that fly overseas. Amsterdam isn't really on the same level. It's obviously a big, important global city in its own right, but for a lot of destinations, it has less than half of the sort of origin and destination demand, right? You look at cities like Austin or New York or Dallas or Miami or wherever. The bigger thing with Amsterdam is dating all the way back to the 1990s and the Northwest Airlines alliance. Amsterdam has been the SkyTeam connecting hub to get passengers deeper into Europe, as well as to the Middle East and to Africa and to other parts of the globe. Right? Amsterdam was a very, very important connecting hub. Northwest Airlines' original services to India routed via Amsterdam to both Mumbai and to Delhi. They even announced, but never operated, a service to Bangalore at one point from Amsterdam. Right? That role, I don't think is something that you can rely on in the same way. And so part of what Copenhagen offers is the ability to diversify how some of those connecting flows are handled. It helps you diversify how you get passengers to and from Scandinavia, just as a quintessential example. There's lots and lots of US to Scandinavia or even Southern Europe to Scandinavia traffic that routes via Amsterdam. And if you need to take some of the pressure off of that operation, both in terms of how you're flowing passengers through there, if you've got to cut flights or frequencies, Copenhagen can allow you to serve some of those same traffic flows. Same with getting passengers from the United States to Eastern Europe, or from the United States to the Middle East, or even to Asia if one day Russian overflight rights come back, right? Finnair built a very, very big business on exactly that type of traffic flow. And so if you look at Copenhagen from a geographic positioning perspective, it can actually meaningfully serve that sort of similar role to what Amsterdam does in the network. It's not quite as advantageous geographically, both because it's further east than Amsterdam and further north than Amsterdam, but it's at least, a reasonable sort of facsimile for some of the traffic flows that flow through Amsterdam, right? It probably can't be the same type of gateway to the United Kingdom, but it can be for, Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Finland and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Poland. The really interesting question that then emanates from this is, where do you see service get added to and from Copenhagen downstream of this? Because if you look at sort of SkyTeam airline operations within, to and from Copenhagen, right, from the United States, there's a lot of dots that are missing. And part of what this order is about, I would imagine, is actually connecting in the other big sources of demand to and from Europe from the United States, as well as those other big Delta hubs, right? Because the other piece of this, right, is if you look at their operations to the United States, right now they serve Atlanta, Boston, Newark, Washington, Dulles, New York, JFK, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, which is a Delta operation. Same with one of the JFK flights, Chicago O'Hare, Seattle, and San Francisco. You could absolutely see Delta pick up some additional flying from places like Seattle, right? You could see sort of other destinations like Austin, which has, increasingly looked like it's going to grow into being a Delta hub, get added to the network. Detroit seems like a particularly big hole. Salt Lake City as well. I think you could see a bunch of new growth to and from Delta hubs in the United States. In addition to, I think Miami would be a sort of quintessential example of a place that sends lots of connections via Amsterdam and KLM, right? Orlando for European origin travelers, so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of growth to come, and it'll be very interesting to see how the transatlantic networks shake out as SAS really fully materializes into the transatlantic joint venture. You're muted again.
So moving on to our next topic, let's go into easyJet. So Castle Lake, which is a U.S. private equity firm, is trying to take easyJet private with the deal that's valued anywhere between 5.2 and 7.3 billion pounds sterling. easyJet had rejected some earlier bids, saying that they were too low, and the board agreed in principle in early July, at the time of recording on July 8th, to Castle Lake's sweetened offer of £6.9 per share in cash, with the partial unlisted share alternative for some shareholders, which would give them about a 75% premium over where the stock traded before the takeover rumors surfaced. The movements date back to May, and that's when easyJet was under pressure due to high fuel prices, weak demand following the Iran war. And so where we stand with this is that it's kind of only an agreement in principle. It's not a done deal. And Castle Lake has to formalize a binding offer by August 3rd under UK takeover rules, or it will walk away. And this is also kind of tricky because the EU is involved as well, because they require airlines operating in the bloc to be majority owned and controlled by EU nationals. So given the fact that Castle Lake's structure is US based, it could only hold 49% of the bidding vehicle, with the rest split between the two EU nationals. And then we have our friend Peter Ballou, who I think had a little stint at Malaysia Airlines a decade ago. He's the former COO of easyJet, and he's been involved with this again. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting, right? Obviously, it's been a tumultuous time for low-cost carriers around the world. There are exceptions, Ryanair, Indigo, sort of, take your pick. But lots and lots of low-cost carriers around the world have suffered both from some of the post-pandemic impacts on labor, on flight operations, on pilots, certainly, right? But also from fuel prices, more recently in the wake of the Iran. Now, I will say that Europe's low-cost aviation sector is a lot healthier than that of the United States, right? You're not seeing the sort of like graveyard of ULCC carcasses that seems to be racking up within the United States. But easyJet is really, really interesting because you can make an argument from the theory of the case for private equity firms that some of the component pieces within easyJet are more valuable as assets than they are as airline operations, right? So easyJet is organized as a sort of quintessential European low cost carrier, but they're not quite Ryanair, if that makes sense, for a couple of very, very important reasons, right? Ryanair, if you look at Ryanair, or even someone like Wizz Air, right, tends to operate from primarily secondary airports. They obviously do a lot of business with sort of broader holiday packages, but it's not quite as vertically integrated as easyJet and the broader sort of like travel business is for easyJet. A lot of what they do is not just sell you a flight, but sell you a bundled travel package therein. And relative to someone like Ryanair, I would actually describe them as, if Ryanair is to Spirit, right? EasyJet is probably something closer to what Southwest Airlines used to be in the like, I don't know, 1990s or 2000s. Still very much a low cost carrier, still very much a low fare airline, but a little nicer, a little bit less punitive with a little bit more of a robust operating environment. Now, underneath that, let me go back to this notion of the sort of parts being worth more than the whole. If you were to take a closer look at easyJet's operations, kind of one of the biggest differentiators relative to a Ryanair or a Wizz Air, but for different reasons. Wizz Air in their case, because they historically grew up in Eastern Europe, where you have sort of newer, less full airports, for lack of a better word, and Ryanair, who very, very explicitly takes a strategy of we're going to operate from the cheapest possible airport that could be plausibly claimed to serve this metro area in the broadest possible definition. Bergamo for Milan, Beauvoir for Paris, Charleroi for Brussels, right? That's not easyJet's model. You look at where easyJet operates. They operate from London Gatwick. They operate from Milan Malpensa, which is sort of like a half joke in the sense that Linate is the kind of true close-in premium airport within Milan, but it's also not Bergamo exactly. They operate from Geneva. They operate from Manchester. They operate from Luton, Bristol, Nice, Belfast, Palma de Mallorca, Amsterdam, Basel, Edinburgh, Paris, Charles de Gaulle, Naples, Berlin, Glasgow, Lisbon, Lyon, right? Like we're talking about primary airports. And they have meaningful slot portfolios at many of these airports. So Lisbon, for example, completely busted in terms of slot availability. Every airline and their brother is trying to get access to primetime flying slots at Lisbon. They've got something like 35, 36 slot pairs available to them at Lisbon. Like, how valuable would those be if you put them up for auction on the open market? Same with Amsterdam, now given the flight cap. Paris is by no means completely full, but there's, plenty of sort of gate space availability. London Gatwick is slot controlled. They've got valuable access to gates and resources and assets. And part of the premise here would be that, if you think about what private equity does, right, to a lot of businesses and a lot of industries, they look for financially profitable transactions. And in the case of easyJet, because of their sort of operating architecture, right, where each base kind of almost operates independently of the others, they're not organized the way that a Delta is, where they have to be able to fly you everywhere, all at once, right? You could see portions of the airline get sold off under this architecture, or see the easyJet conglomerate get broken into a series of smaller airlines potentially, right? To help facilitate this. Already they have 3 operating certificates: easyJet UK, easyJet Switzerland, easyJet Europe. Is there a world where you break those 3 airlines apart and then you do some targeted asset sales underneath that to generate quick returns or to pay down some debt? Right. I think with private equity owners, sometimes they're just going to come in and run the airline, and maybe they have a theory of the case for how you run the airline better, the way that Elliott did with their sort of like partially aborted attempted Southwest shakedown or takeover, depending on your perspective. But they could also just have the perspective of, hey, we want to, strip this thing for parts. And that is very much a tactic that's within the private equity operating plan. And so I'm curious, Rohan, what your take is on what Castle Lake will do with easyJet. Do you think they'll go down more the path of, we have a different theory for how to operate this airline? Because, in the European market, I don't know what those moves look like. Or do you think they're going to strip it for parts, cut capacity, or do something of the sort?
Knowing private equity and my thoughts on private equity, I'm going to go with the latter, because at the end of the day, all of their guidance is that someone will backfill the space, and it's really all about getting rich quick. So it's not about propping up an airline. It's not about creating a product or a brand that helps keep prices down. It's about who takes over, who is able to, make these controlling decisions in order to juice up the value of the assets and then exit. I don't believe
But I
I
don't
mean,
know that that's universally true, right? Like like ultimately, right? Private equity firms operate on a thesis, right? And you've got groups like Indigo Partners, for example, right? That do actually have a genuine thesis of we're going to come in, we're going to build a rinse and repeat ULCC model that has scaled across the world, right? Like if you look at Indigo Partners, they've run that playbook with Frontier Airlines, with JetSmart, with Wizz Air, with Volaris, right? And then, also failed attempts with groups like Lynx Air. But, it is the case that private equity groups like sometimes do actually have like a thesis, right? Elliot, right? You can say what you like about their sort of escapades with Southwest Airlines, but they actually had a concrete theory of what needed to change at Southwest to turn that airline and its profitability and its commercial positioning around, given the operational realities. And I actually didn't disagree necessarily with all of it, truthfully, given what Southwest's sort of cost base and legacy and sort of infrastructure had kind of become, right? So I don't know that it's necessarily always the case that private equity strip mines for parts. I just think it's kind of interesting with easyJet because they've got some pretty uniquely valuable assets in the form of gates, planes, and slots, especially at major European airports. And that makes them distinct from someone like a Ryanair. And I think that's like part of what
yeah,
has me interested in where this goes.
yeah, definitely. Well, we'll have the opportunity to circle back to it in August, I guess, once we know more information. So, American Airlines announced that it is going to resume service from Chicago O'Hare to Tokyo Narita. This was a route that it flew effectively from the 1990s, I want to say, up until the early months of 2020. Now, that was not a COVID closure route. It was part of American shutting down all of its Chicago O'Hare to Asia routes. And I think that this route is a very interesting one to hone in on for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is part of American clawing its way back at Chicago O'Hare by adding some routes, particularly longer haul routes that it had cut from Chicago, like to Honolulu and to Kahului, Maui, now adding Tokyo Narita back in, being able to support a 787 pilot and crew base out of O'Hare, being able to fly more than just London Heathrow on a year round basis on American Airlines, being relevant to the market, supporting its joint venture partner, Japan Airlines. And also, there's just a lot of history on the Chicago to Tokyo market itself between United and American. United having flights to Haneda and then also adding another flight to Narita that was announced earlier this summer. Being in a joint venture with All Nippon Airways, which has a flight to Haneda and to Narita. And then Japan Airlines, which has a flight to Haneda existing and had flown to Narita. This is a route that they re added a couple months ago, along with a push from Narita to Delhi and to a couple others. So I know that the fares on this market are the best. And now the seat capacity flooding that's taking place is going to get even more diluted, especially with high fuel prices. There's a lot of commentary on how this is an addition by subtraction, that this is just American adding another JV route, which isn't all that interesting. People were kind of crying that the airline made a very misleading marketing post by showing social media indication that it was going to fly to Osaka instead of Tokyo, which was like a rumor. But a lot of people are essentially saying American shutting down its flight from Philly to Doha and taking that plane, sending it to Chicago, starting a flight to Narita. Japan Airlines is pulling out of that market. And
Yeah,
they're also
it's
adding a
taking
flight to
from
Ontario.
it's taking from the left pocket and posting in the right pocket. Well, I think first it is worth calling out that there's actually some real history on the Chicago to Tokyo routing. Historically, right, this was a routing that was at one point on the U.S. side served by Pan Am and Northwest. People actually forget that Northwest was the other U.S. carrier that had sort of like Chicago Tokyo authorities, right? United ended up taking that over and becoming kind of the carrier that was granted sort of access from Chicago to Tokyo in the wake of sort of Pan Am's, demise and kind of its sort of asset sales, sort of circling back to that theme from our previous segment, right? But there's a lot of history here. American tried to get access to the Chicago-Tokyo Authority as early as 1990. They launched service in 1998 with MD-11s, and they continuously operated Chicago to Tokyo for 22 years. And over the years, they actually did other routings from Chicago to Asia. They had a flight from Chicago to Delhi. They had a flight from, I believe at one point, from Chicago to Shanghai and to Beijing as well, from O'Hare as that sort of like
They did Chicago
trans-Pacific gateway.
Nagoya briefly in like 2005, 2006 too.
Exactly, right? So they have a long history of trans-Pacific service at Chicago that it got shrunk down over the years as American sort of lost, took its eye off the ball in the Chicago market. And we've, covered that sort of broader theme ad nauseum. But I think it is worth just sort of registering that, yeah, there is a lot of history on this route for American. They've fought it out before with United for the authority to run this route, but back before the US and Japan had open skies agreement. So I still think it's meaningful, right? Like it does show that they're sort of waking up and getting into the ball game in Chicago, right? At the end of the day, yes, it's a replacement of, a Japan Airlines flight on Japan Airlines metal. Yes, it's ultimately the sort of shrinking down of a route that probably doesn't make as much sense today in July of 2026 from Philadelphia to Doha to help fund this from an aircraft perspective. But it's still meaningful. It's still nonstop trans-Pacific service that you can fly an American Airlines plane on out of Chicago. And that is meaningful, right? I think it's really easy to sort of, wave your hands and say, hey, there's no net new capacity and so on and so forth. But it is still meaningful that American Airlines is taking an active step to make sure that you can get to and from Tokyo on a nonstop flight and to and from a good chunk of Asia with one connection in Tokyo nonstop from Chicago on American Airlines metal for the largest chunk of that. That's still
Yeah.
kind of meaningful. And it's not a world-changing announcement the way that it would have been if they had announced, like, I don't know, Chicago to Osaka or something along those lines. But it's also not a nothing burger. And I think that that's, overdone by half when people kind of analyze it from that lens. I
Yes.
think the more
Yes.
interesting question for me is, are there any other routes that they could do to Chicago? And the reason I ask that question, right, is American has sort of organized its trans-Pacific and transatlantic networks largely around partner hubs, right? So there's a lot of service to and from Heathrow. There's a lot of service to and from, especially on the trans-Pacific side, to and from Tokyo Narita. Over the last several years, and Haneda, over the last several years, you have seen both United and Delta focus on building meaningful trans-Pacific operations to secondary, and you might even say tertiary in the case of United with its Narita mini hub destinations. Places like Kaohsiung in Taiwan, Ulaanbaatar, right? Or, Ho Chi Minh City and Bangkok in Southeast Asia via Hong Kong, right? So United has obviously gone the furthest. You're now seeing Delta start to meaningfully dip its toes back in with service from LAX to Hong Kong, with the rumored additions of Singapore and Manila to the network, with Seattle to Taipei service. American has just been behind the eight ball in a variety of different ways, right? They do have service to India, which Delta does not, and that's non-trivial and that's meaningful, right? But it's just one route from New York JFK to New Delhi, and then outside of that, their Asian network is remarkably threadbare by comparison, right? Pre-pandemic, they had pretty meaningfully sized sort of attempts at building a Trans-Pacific gateway in LAX, at building a Trans-Pacific gateway in DFW. These days, that sort of network is a lot lighter. So I guess a question for you is, do you think there are any other Asian or trans-Pacific routes? And I think maybe we can hone in specifically on trans-Pacific routes because you could see at some point American adding back service from Chicago to India. But do you think there are other trans-Pacific routes that American could add as it, attempts to pick a fight in Chicago?
Well, to be quite honest with you, if we look at the only alliance that seems to be really growing, it's One World. One World is adding Alaska, Hawaii. They just announced that Philippine Airlines is joining them. They have One World Connect partners. They have, I think it's Oman Air that's also joining them. DFW has gained so many routes, right, to places like Hong Kong on Cathay Pacific or adding Melbourne on Qantas. And so to me, it seems that if the One World Alliance is growing and the partners and the number of competitors that are becoming part of one world seem to be increasing, why would American add its own metal into those markets unless they had metal neutrality, right? And that metal neutrality is very dependent upon JAL with its, joint venture to Tokyo, and then Qantas with its joint venture down under. Alaska Airlines, which operates a decent number of trans-Pacific flights from its Honolulu and Anchorage hubs, are not part of that joint venture. And could they be part of that joint venture? Well, that kind of depends. Like, that is all dependent on the US Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice, if they would allow that in, because then it becomes very saturated. I don't think that American should resume flights from Chicago to Beijing or Shanghai. And I don't know if, a flight to Seoul, given the fact that it would have to overstep parts of Russia with the closures, I don't think that those would be economically viable. I also don't look at the fare data and Cirium as I probably could, just to kind of see what average fares we're looking at. But demand is down to China. It's not the same as it was a few years ago. Cathay Pacific already flies from Chicago to Hong Kong. And word on the street, and this is unconfirmed, is that when Cathay Pacific started flights to Dallas, it took a hit. The Chicago to Hong Kong flight took a hit. So I don't see it happening from Chicago. From Los Angeles, people have talked about it, and people have speculated that there could be, an opportunity for LA to Manila or LA to Singapore, but I don't see it. I don't see American emulating anything that United does out of San Francisco, nor do I really see Delta emulating anything in Seattle, that United does, because the O&D is there in San Francisco, and the fares and the premium demand is there in San
Well, the
Francisco.
O&D and the fares and the premium demand are there in LAX, to be fair. To be fair
True,
as well.
true. I misspoke. The O&D is there in LA. It may not be as much there in Seattle. The O&D is there. The market is saturated, though,
Well,
in
the market
LA.
is fragmented is actually probably the bigger thing, right? The market is fragmented, which means that you're fighting it out with Delta and United for every LA bound or LA sort of homed passenger. And the market is fragmented in such a way that you can't build a large enough operation to build enough connecting feed to grow into those secondary and tertiary Asian destinations, right? You look at Delta at Seattle, they've got service to Haneda, Seoul, Shanghai, and Taipei. You look at Delta at LAX, they've got service to Hong Kong, Tokyo, Haneda, and Shanghai. You compare that to United at SFO, it's just in a different galaxy, right? United at SFO has service to Hong Kong, Tokyo, Haneda, Tokyo Narita, Seoul, Osaka, Manila, Beijing, Shanghai, Singapore, and Taipei. It's just in a different galaxy, right? Now, all of that being said, I do think that at some point Americans going to have to make a run at it. And will they make a run at it out of LAX, right? You can make an argument that they probably have the most advantageous gate position once some of the rework of the Eagle's Nest and terminals 3 and 4 are completed, right? Sorry, 4 and 5 are completed rather. They'll have the most gates of any of those three carriers, right? Plus, they could probably get their new One World partner and friend Alaska to kick in some of their gates as well at some point. So there's a world where American can actually turn LAX into that sort of West Coast stronghold, but Delta seems to be spoiling for that fight. They just added a second Delta One lounge at LAX, right? So I don't think Delta's going to let that lie. And United, I think, has sort of an innovator's dilemma, right? Where because SFO is such a strong, such a powerful trans-Pacific operation, they're only ever going to pour so many resources into LAX. And they have, I think, the worst sort of terminal setup in LAX.
Yeah. Americans in a tough spot. Airlines like Delta and United, they have pretty enviable hubs across the vast majority of their network. What are the marginal hubs for Delta? Maybe Seattle, maybe a little of LA, but the focus is there. What are the marginal hubs for American? You got a lot. You got LA, New York, Chicago, and that's big.
Well, the problem for American is less so that there are marginal hubs, because they also have a lot more fortress hubs than someone like United, right? You look at American, right? They've got DFW, that's a fortress. They've got Charlotte, that's a fortress with price gouging level fares. They've got DCA, which is absolutely the best operation in the Washington D.C. area from a profitability perspective. They've got Philadelphia, right? a lot of American Airlines' hubs, even a place like Phoenix, they've got a lot of competition with Southwest there, so I wouldn't put it in quite the same category. But they've got a lot of really, really strong domestic hubs. What they lack is meaningful hub operations in the coastal and global cities that drive international demand, that can create the kind of international network you need to feed desirability for your frequent flyer program. Because ultimately, all these airlines make their money on selling miles and selling credit card subscriptions, right? They're actually finance companies masquerading as airlines, right? And so their number 3 or arguably number 4 position in the New York metro area really stings because they don't have enough scale at either LaGuardia or JFK to be relevant to the local New York consumer in the same way that United at Newark or Delta with its, probably twice the size operation at both those airports is, right? In LAX, depending on the year, they bounce between numbers 1 and 3, but they're not strong enough to have to make a meaningful dent given some of the other constraints they have in their overall intercontinental strategy. They don't have an SFO on the West Coast. They don't have a Salt Lake City or a Denver in the Mountain West. They are number 2 and a pretty far behind number 2 in Chicago, though they're trying to rectify that. Right. So I think some of this is downstream of their hubs. Their strongest hubs are in the wrong places. DFW is a gem. I think Charlotte was, for lack of a better word, overbuilt for a while, right? That operation literally can't handle more traffic, and it doesn't have enough volumetric demand to feed some of these long haul destinations in quite the same way. So I think, we've once every 3 episodes, we end up going on down a sort of rabbit hole tangent about the problems with American Airlines. But even when they've done something that's, genuinely good and interesting and kind of signals a strategic recommitment to the Chicago market, you still end up back in the same place, which is they're kind of up the creek without a paddle. Well, so thank you everyone for listening to the latest episode of the Airways podcast. As always, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your audio consumption in. Be sure to leave us a review, share the episode with your friends, or if you didn't like the episode, with your enemies. And we will see you at some point in the next 2 to 11 weeks looking at our average recording schedule.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone.